Long ago, when time seems suspended in another dimension. Long ago, when the world was wrapped in wonder. Long ago, a lie was told, whispered into reality, interrupting time, twisting that which was declared good. The lie slithered its way into the mind of humankind. The lie said, "You are not good enough. The way you were created is not good enough. You don't do enough. You don't know enough. You do not have enough." The lie was clever, masked in temptation, a titillating fruit. Let's be honest. Any one of us would have jumped on that juicy lie. Just to imagine the possibility of being like God, being in ultimate control, having universes of knowledge, having all the power to do whatever we wanted to do. You know that fruit dangling from that tree in the ancient garden long ago? That fruit was the lie that humans bit into. A poison apple, a plague-ridden pear that penetrated the hearts of all humans to come. The moment the lie touched human lips, scales formed over their eyes and they could no longer see the goodness in God's creation. They immediately looked down at their bodies and only felt shame. Shame. So much shame. The shame of their naked bodies removed them from the presence of God. Even when they heard God's voice in the garden, they hid. But then God discovers them, trying desperately to help them. God asks, "Who told you you were naked?" It was the lie they consumed. The lie that said, "You are not good enough." This very lie caused them to hide in shame from God's holy presence. Shame is the shadow cast upon holiness. In her recent book, Shameless, priest and author Natalie Boltz-Weber defines holiness like this. Holiness is the union we experience with one another and with God. However, this holiness was severed by shame not too long after God looked down at humans and said, "You are very good." The original sin in Genesis 3 was the manifestation of a lie that covered human eyes with dark shades of shame. The sin that Adam and Eve participated in, the act of disobedience, created this ripple in time, a warped reality that we human beings are still trying to reverse and rewind. When we sin, when we separate ourselves from God's love, we let that lie live in our hearts, live in our heads, and live out of our hands. The lie that tells our hearts we are not loved enough. So we get stuck in this sin of pride, and we keep trying to please everyone and anyone in search of love. And then the lie that tells our heads we do not have enough knowledge. So we get trapped in this sin of fear. And we hoard all of our resources and our love from others. And then this lie that tells our hands we can never do enough. So we get entombed in the sin of anger and keep doing and doing and doing until the love dies. This lie, we are not good enough, can lead us to break God's law of love. God said, "Do not eat from the tree that produces lies, for it will distort how you see my goodness." God created you and me to see beauty, to live out love, and to be in union with God and with others. But the lie consumed long ago created an alternative universe, a place where humankind could no longer withstand the naked truth. The truth being that God creates all of us in God's image, and that we are still very good. I find it interesting that we often choose to live out of Genesis 3 instead of Genesis 1. We often prefer to label people as the fallen instead of the good. And this pivotal passage of Scripture engages a number of challenging questions. Are men superior to women? Why is childbearing so painful? And of course, the most important being, did snakes really have legs? But this morning I would like to focus on something so basic that we can't bear to talk about it. Our bodies. God creates our bodies as good, very good, and yet we keep consistently believing that our bodies are bad. From a very young age, we are often told, implicitly and unconsciously by culture, that there is something wrong with our bodies. Little boys and little girls are placed into body binaries. Girls wear pink, boys wear blue, and if you don't do that, then there's something wrong with you. I mean, girls do ballet, boys play football, and God forbid they switch sports. From a young age, we view our bodies, or our bodies are shaped by the way society views them, or even our religious beliefs tell us to view them. And then, of course, the dreaded days of puberty, when teenagers are told that what is happening with their bodies is evil. Hormones, hair, hunger pains that suddenly become sources of shame. And then young adults, moving from 20s to 30s into their 40s, don't quite understand why or when their metabolism stopped working and they gained 10, 20, 50 pounds. I mean, however it happened, whether it's from childbearing or too much beer drinking, their bodies now feel wrong, and shame sets in again. And then those men and women growing through the Middle Ages now have wrinkles appearing, and their bones are aching, and their body parts are failing. They too feel more shame. And then those who live with canes, move with walkers, or ride in wheelchairs, they live as the fallen in a completely different way. But they too feel the gravity of shame. I mean, if we're completely honest with ourselves, there really is no good period to be a human, no perfect age where we aren't told that our bodies are bad and we should hide them behind shame. The naked truth is that we can't seem to ever love our God-given naked bodies. Okay, before you get all squirmy in your pew, let me clarify the naked truth. Let me tell you a story about my brothers. When I was 18, I went on my senior trip to France and Spain, and when I returned to the U.S., my mother picked me up from the airport and drove us back to the family ranch. The ranch being this large garden of cactus and cattle in the middle of Texas. It was very late. And so we were driving really slowly, looking for deer who would jump out in front of our car at any moment. We soon pulled onto the dirt road of the ranch that winds around the land and then down to our home. We passed the cattle guard and the barn and the hay stables, when suddenly, out of the darkness, a naked figure jets across the road and out in front of the car. My mom and I are screaming because my little brother, Dylan, is running through pasture with nothing on but leather boots. And my older brother is standing in the shadows with a video camera recording our reaction. That was the first day I cursed. This is actually when I learned that there is a stark difference between being naked and being naked. You know the difference. Naked is simply just to be naked. Naked is being naked and up to no good. This morning, we are talking about naked, not naked. Adam and Eve were naked in the garden, not naked. But we church folks are taught that to simply be naked means that our bodies are up to no good. And this is why it's hard for us to view our bodies as holy, created as good. We religious people can't seem to tell the difference and end up demonizing our bodies and the bodies of others. As followers of Christ, we not only look at Genesis 3 for body language, but also to the Apostle Paul, who writes things like, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We must die to our flesh. We all have thorns in the flesh. But this word flesh that Paul often refers to is less about how our bodies were created and more about how our minds distort how we live in these bodies. Remember, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus put on skin and came to earth. His body grew from a little boy, somehow making it through puberty, and then developed into a flesh and blood, full-grown adult. Then his body would be broken, buried, and then brought back. If these bodies are good enough for Christ, then we should know that they are good enough for us. It is in these bodies that we mirror the image of God, that we live out divine holiness. Natalie Boltz-Weber continues to write in her book, saying that holiness is when more than one become one. When what is fractured is made whole. Singing in harmony, breastfeeding a baby, collective bargaining, dancing, admitting our pain to someone and hearing them say, "Me too." Holiness is the song that has always been sung, perhaps even the sound that first spoke when God said, "Let there be light." Our bodies were created to be in communion with God, others, and all creation. But what happens when shame casts that dark shadow into the light of God's goodness? Because of shame, we can easily fall into sin, and sin then leads to guilt and regret. But oftentimes we think shame and guilt are the same. So what is the difference between shame and guilt? Shame is what we experience when we believe the lie that says we are not good enough. Guilt is what we experience when shame leads us to use our body in destructive or dehumanizing ways. Shame often comes before guilt. Shame is believing in the lie. Guilt is living out of the lie. When this happens over and over again from generation to generation, we seem to get stuck in this cycle of shame and guilt that keeps spinning the world in the wrong direction. And because the world is spinning in a shame-filled direction, religion has made attempts to try to counter this kind of sickening carnival ride of sinful living. Religions like Christianity has used purity as means to stop the never-ending loophole of shame and guilt. But religious purity is not divine holiness. Purity is about separation from, while holiness is about union with. Religious purity removes us, Christians, from the world in which God created us to live in. And this kind of pure living can leave us even more confused about our bodies. Young adults are often told to turn off their sexual urges until they get married and then suddenly turn them back on. Older folks who live their entire lives with the spouse they love, and then when that beloved person is gone, they too are confused about their bodies. And this is why we have to have healthy relationships, conversations around how do we live into God's holiness. But religious purity often perpetuates shame in attempts to live righteous, sinless lives. But what if sin is the manifestation of shame, that perhaps religious purity is missing the point? What if we, followers of Christ, exchange our sinless purity for shameless holiness? We might then live Christ-like lives that no longer remove ourselves from others, but allow God to bring us alongside others. For we are all created by a God who keeps searching for us, not running from us. God, the Creator, calls us out of hiding, calls us out of our shame so that we can live in shameless holiness. During the season of Lent, we will be diving into more stories from the book of Genesis, stories that are often used to shame people. We will learn together how we can live shameless lives of holiness. Living shameless lives of holiness gives us courage to look at ourselves in the mirror and see the naked truth of God's love. We are good enough. Shameless lives of holiness also allows us to love all God's children as if they were born out of Genesis 1, not Genesis 3, out of the same God-given goodness. Living shameless lives of holiness means we follow Christ, who always errs on the side of grace, on the side of God's grace, and not on the side of human disgrace. I'll conclude with these words from the Apostle Paul that we heard read earlier, Romans chapter 5. For if the many died through one human sin, much more surely will have the grace of God and the free gift and the grace of the one human Jesus Christ, who lived and died and rose again for the salvation of all. Amen.